The diner door slapped shut behind Gabe Mercer, and the bell kept chiming over his shoulder. Inside, the air smelled like fryer grease and burnt coffee. A dusty radio behind the counter buzzed through a weather report. Gabe didn't raise his voice. He stood there with his hat low, one hand steady on Rex's leash. Rex, a German shepherd, sat tight to Gabe's boot, warm breath on Gabe's shin. Deputy Harlan blocked the aisle and grinned for the room. He yanked the leash like it was a joke. Gabe said, "Don't touch my dog." The Stonehive secret in Cochise County. Harlan didn't let go. He looked around, collecting eyes, like he needed the crowd to back him up. Then Sheriff Dalton Rusk stepped through the doorway, calm as a man walking into his own house. His badge flashed under the fluorescent lights, and the room went quiet on instinct. Rusk didn't threaten. He just set a hand on the counter and let the deputy feel that weight. The leash went slack. "Mr. Mercer," Rusk said, polite as Sunday, "you've been busy out on that north pasture." That was the mistake. Gabe hadn't given his name. Nobody had said a word about the Stonehive. Rex's shoulders tightened, but he stayed seated. Gabe paid, turned, and walked out into the grit wind. 2 foreclosure envelopes waited on his truck seat. They wanted him small. He wasn't going to stay small. If you stand with our veterans, subscribe, because what happens next changes everything. Gabe didn't argue his way out of the diner. He just walked Rex out into the grit wind and let the door slap shut behind them. Grease and burnt coffee clung to his clothes. The bell over the door kept chiming like it was scolding him. In the parking lot, heat shimmered off the hood of his pickup. 2 white envelopes waited on the seat. Final notice. He didn't open them. He didn't have to. Rex jumped in and sat facing forward, ears pricked, watching the street. Gabe pulled out slow. In his mirror, a sheriff's cruiser eased out from a side road and settled behind him. No lights, no rush, just a quiet tail. Rex tracked it, head turning inch by inch. Gabe kept his hands steady on the wheel, eyes on the 2-lane highway. The cruiser stayed on him for a mile, then peeled off like it had delivered a message. At the diner window, an older woman with silver hair, Martha Klein, watched him go, lips pressed thin. Gabe didn't know it yet, but she'd remember every detail. He drove home thinking one plain thought. If there was any water left on his land, it was under the Stonehive. The ranch sat past the last mailbox, where gravel replaced pavement, and the wind carried sand that stung your teeth. The trough was empty. Fence posts leaned. The windmill squeaked once, then went quiet again. Gabe stood in the yard and listened to a silence that felt too wide. North of the house, the Stonehive rose out of dead ground. Gray-red clay hardened into something close to rock, taller than his truck, wide as a small barn. Old locals called it bad luck. Gabe called it a last chance. He'd heard one thing that made sense. Deep earth holds what surface heat can't steal. Ray Cutter rolled up in a battered Ford and didn't bother with small talk. "You hit that mound, you might wake up trouble," he said. Gabe looked toward town, then back at his dry pasture. "Trouble already found me." Ray's eyes went to Rex. "Your dog's acting off?" "He will," Gabe said, "if I'm right." Ray tipped his cap and left Gabe to his decision. The ranch sat past the last mailbox, where gravel replaced pavement and the wind carried sand that stung your teeth. The trough was empty. Fence posts leaned. The windmill squeaked once, then went quiet again. Gabe stood in the yard and listened to a silence that felt too wide. North of the house, the Stonehive rose out of dead ground. Gray-red clay hardened into something close to rock, taller than his truck, wide as a small barn. Old locals called it bad luck. Gabe called it a last chance. He'd heard one thing that made sense. Deep earth holds what surface heat can't steal. Ray Cutter rolled up in a battered Ford and didn't bother with small talk. "You hit that mound, you might wake up trouble," he said. Gabe looked toward town, then back at his dry pasture. "Trouble already found me." Ray's eyes went to Rex. "Your dog's acting off?" "He will," Gabe said, "if I'm right." Ray tipped his cap and left Gabe to his decision. Rex's claws tore at hardpan, throwing dirt back in steady arcs. No play in it, no curiosity. Work. He whined low, barked again, then looked back at Gabe like he was begging him to understand. Gabe climbed down and walked in, boots crunching. He didn't rush. He watched the dog's body, ears pinned, shoulders tight, eyes fixed on the hole. That was a warning Gabe trusted. He grabbed the long-handled shovel off the dozer and drove it into the spot. The soil was packed tight, mixed with that same clay. He put his boot on the shovel and leaned. It gave an inch. Then another. Rex dug on the far side, matching him. The shovel struck metal with a deep, hollow clang. Gabe stopped breathing for a beat. He scraped wide, careful now. A corner appeared, then a flat plate, thick steel, rivets, a recessed ring handle in the center. Not farm equipment, not a tank cover. This was mill spec. He rubbed the surface with his glove until faded paint showed through. Letters came up under the rust, stenciled hard and official. Project Duskline. The wind shifted cold. Gabe looked west and saw a brown wall rising. Dust storm, moving fast. Rex pressed against his leg, trembling, eyes flicking between the hatch and the sky. "Not tonight," Gabe said. He dragged a sheet of corrugated tin over the spot and kicked dirt across the edges. It wasn't much. It was time. The storm hit before he made it back to the porch. Sand stung his cheeks and coated his tongue. By dark, the wind was screaming through the seams of the house, pushing dust under the doors in thin brown lines. Gabe sat at the kitchen table with a mug of coffee that went cold in his hands. The 2 bank envelopes lay by the sink like they owned the place. Rex lay on the rug at Gabe's feet, head up, eyes following every shadow the lamp made. The dog's breathing stayed slow, steady, something Gabe could borrow when his own chest tried to tighten. Outside, tin rattled. A branch scraped the siding. Gabe's jaw clenched and his mind tried to pull him somewhere else. He planted his hand on Rex's shoulder. Warm fur. Solid muscle. Real. "We're here," Gabe whispered. Rex's ears twitched. He lifted his head higher, testing the air. Gabe heard it too, faint under the wind. An engine, low and controlled, not a neighbor's rattling truck. Then the crunch of tires on gravel, stopping short of the porch. Rex stood up, slow and silent, and the fur along his spine rose like a ridge. A low growl started in his chest, steady, deep, meant for someone who understood warnings. Gabe crossed to the front window and lifted the blind a finger's width. A black SUV sat in his drive, spotless, wrong on a dusty ranch road. Headlights off. 2 doors opened. 2 men stepped out in pressed clothes and clean shoes. Not locals? They walked up without hurry, like they'd done it before. Rex moved to Gabe's side and stayed there, shoulder pressed to Gabe's shin, growl still humming. The knock came, firm, official, certain. Gabe didn't reach for drama. He reached for the deadbolt, cold metal under his fingers. He breathed once, slow, and opened the door just a crack. Porch light hit 2 faces, calm, clean-cut, unreadable. The older one gave a small, polite smile. "Mr. Mercer," he said, like they were old acquaintances. "We need to talk about what you dug up today." Gabe kept the chain on the door and opened it just enough to see their faces. Dust scraped along the porch boards in the wind. Rex stood in the gap, shoulder first, a low growl buzzing in his chest like a warning you could feel. The older man wore a pressed jacket and a polite smile that didn't reach his eyes. The younger one kept scanning the dark yard, like he expected company. "Mr. Mercer," the older man said, calm as a banker. "County Land Compliance. We received an automated report of unauthorized excavation on your property." "That report know it's midnight?" Gabe asked. "We need to inspect the site," the younger one said, too quick. Gabe watched their shoes, clean, no desert grit. "No warrant," he said. "No badge. You're not coming in." The older man nodded like Gabe had just signed a form. "Non-compliance gets documented. We'll return at first light." Rex's growl deepened. The younger man's hand drifted toward his jacket, then stopped when the older man gave him a look. Gabe didn't move. "Try daylight," he said. "Bring paper." They walked back to a spotless black SUV. Before it rolled off, the older man turned and added, "And Mr. Mercer, covering it up won't help you." Gabe locked the deadbolt and stood with his forehead against the door. He hadn't told anyone what he found, yet they spoke like they'd seen it. Before dawn, the storm had burned itself out. The sky was pale and cold, and the ranch smelled like wet dust and old diesel. Gabe loaded a pry bar, a short sledge, rope, and a flashlight. Metal clanked in the truck bed. Rex followed close, ears high, tail low. In the north pasture, the stone hive sat on dead ground like a frozen wave of clay. Gabe peeled back the tin he'd dragged over the spot. Under it, the hatch waited, thick steel, rivets, a recessed wheel. He brushed rust away with his glove until the stenciled words came up clear. Project Duskline, 1968. Gabe set the pry bar in the wheel and leaned. Nothing. He struck the bar with the sledge. The clang ran across the pasture and died in the open air. He hit it again. Rust cracked with a sharp, ugly pop. The wheel turned a single inch. A long hiss escaped the seal, like the ground letting out a breath it had held for decades. The smell rolled up right after, clean and wrong, chemicals, damp mold, and a metallic bite that stuck to Gabe's throat. Rex yelped and jumped back, ears flattened. He paced in a tight circle and refused to come closer. "It's just stale air," Gabe said, but he kept his face turned away. He pulled the ring handle. The hatch scraped open with a grinding shriek. Blackness waited beneath it. A steel ladder dropped down the side, rungs vanishing into dark. Gabe tied the rope to the bulldozer blade and tested the knot twice. The wind carried grit across his teeth. Rex sat near the opening, trembling, eyes locked on Gabe like he was guarding a cliff edge. "Stay," Gabe said. Rex whined once, then held the sit. Gabe climbed down. The air got colder, wetter. The chemical smell thickened until it coated his tongue. His boots hit metal flooring with a hollow ring. He clicked on the flashlight. Small chamber, steel walls, flaking paint, pipes and cables overhead. And on the far side, a narrow tunnel mouth leading deeper. Gabe's chest tightened hard enough to steal his next breath. For a moment, his body tried to run without moving. Tight space, bad air. That old squeeze in the ribs. His hand shook and the beam jittered across the wall. Then Rex barked from above, steady, urgent, and Gabe heard claws scraping the hatch. Scrape, scrape, scrape. That sound didn't belong to any memory. It belonged to the dog he could trust. Gabe grabbed the rope and forced air in. Slow, in, out. He made his eyes work. Find something. Leave. A shelf was bolted to the wall. He swept the beam across it and saw a leather logbook, swollen at the edges. Beside it sat a yellow meter with a needle gauge. He lifted it and heard the faint tick. Steady, not screaming, but not quiet either. On the floor under the shelf was a gray metal case. He popped the latch. 3 reels of tape, each stamped in hard block letters. Project Duskline. Gabe didn't read longer than he had to. He tucked the tapes and the logbook under one arm, kept the ticking meter in his other hand, and turned back to the ladder. Above him, Rex barked again, louder now, like he could hear footsteps that Gabe couldn't. Gabe climbed fast and broke into daylight on hands and knees, gulping clean air that tasted like dust and sage. Rex was on him immediately, whining and pressing his warm weight into Gabe's shoulder like he was pinning him to the earth. "I'm here," Gabe said into Rex's fur. "I'm here." The meter ticked softly in his hand. Under the morning sun, the needle sat above 0. Not high, not nothing. Just enough to make his stomach go cold. He slid the hatch shut, covered it, then drove the bulldozer forward until the blade sat over the spot like a heavy lid. 10 tons of steel saying, "Not today." Back in the kitchen, he laid the logbook and tapes under the light and set the meter near the sink. Tick, tick, tick. It rode under the refrigerator hum like a bad second clock. His phone buzzed. Unknown number, it stopped, buzzed again. Stopped. Rex stood at the window, watching the road. Gabe drove into town before noon. He parked where he could see both the diner and the sheriff's office, 2 blocks apart. He didn't go near either. He went to a small bungalow with wind chimes that clicked softly in the shade. Martha Klein opened the door with her glasses on a chain. Her house smelled like lemon oil and black tea. Rex leaned in and let her scratch behind his ears, polite and tense. "You look like you didn't sleep," Martha said. "I found something near the stone hive," Gabe answered. "Something with a name." Her eyes sharpened. "What name?" Gabe kept his voice low. Project Duskline. Martha set her mug down very carefully, like the sound might carry through the walls. I remember that summer, she said. Late-night convoys, men who didn't buy boots in town. And your father, he came to my library for engineering journals. Quiet man, worried eyes. Gabe felt his throat tighten. He never told me. They didn't let them tell, Martha said. Gabe, if you're asking questions, they'll watch who you ask. Gabe nodded once and stepped back into the bright street. Half a block down, parked in deep shade like it was hiding in plain sight, sat a spotless black SUV. Gabe didn't stare at the black SUV parked down the block. He acted like he hadn't seen it at all. He just walked Rex to the truck, leash short but loose, boots crunching on grit. The SUV was too clean, sitting too perfect under a cottonwood like it had a reservation. His phone buzzed in his pocket. Unknown number, one hard vibration, then silence. Rex's ears snapped forward and a low rumble rolled out of him. Not a bark, more like a warning you could feel in your knees. Gabe didn't answer. He started the truck and pulled away slow. In the mirror, the SUV waited a beat, then eased out behind him. 2 cars back, not close, not far. Just there. At the first stop sign, Gabe turned right, then left, then right again. He watched Rex watch the road. Rex kept his head still, eyes moving, reading it all. When the SUV finally peeled off, it didn't feel like relief. It felt like someone choosing a better place to wait. Back at the ranch, the wind tasted like dust and sun-baked metal. Gabe locked the gate chain he hadn't locked in years. The link scraped gritty in his hands. Rex stood beside him, nose high, tense but quiet. Inside, the kitchen was dim and still. The yellow meter sat by the sink, ticking under the refrigerator hum. Tick, tick, tick. Gabe wrapped it in a grocery bag and shoved it deep into a feed sack in the pantry. Out of sight, out of easy reach. He opened his late wife's cedar chest and paused when that cedar smell hit him. Then he tucked the logbook and the tape reels under a folded quilt and shut the lid gentle, like it mattered. His phone buzzed again. Unknown number, then a text, short as a threat. We need what you took. Gabe set the phone down and stared at the dark window over the sink. Rex moved to the living room and stood pointed at the back door, body stiff, ears up. Gabe whispered, "Tell me what you've got, buddy." Rex didn't look back. He just listened. Before daylight, Gabe went to the barn lean-to, his father's old workshop. It smelled like dried oil and dust. He pulled a tarp off a heavy reel-to-reel tape player and carried it inside like it was fragile. On the kitchen table, he threaded the first reel. The machine hummed, the reels turned, static hissed, thin and cold. Then a voice came through, clear enough to raise the hair on Gabe's arms. "This is Daniel Mercer," the voice said. "October, 1968. Private log, not for the official file." Gabe's throat went tight. His father's voice was in his house again. Not a story, not a photo. A real voice, trying to stay steady. Rex walked over and pressed his muzzle into Gabe's hand, firm and grounding. Gabe rubbed the dog's ear and kept listening. Daniel talked about pressure tests and containment, and then his tone changed, like he'd stepped from notes into warning. "They're burying the leak," Daniel said. "They're calling me unstable, and they're watching my house." Gabe stopped the tape. The kitchen went quiet except for the refrigerator hum and Gabe's breathing. Gabe called Martha Klein as soon as the sun was up. He didn't explain everything. He didn't have to. "I heard my dad," he said. Martha went silent on the line, then answered soft, "I was afraid you'd find that." "I need your nephew," Gabe said. "The reporter." A minute later, a number came through. Gabe dialed. A young voice answered fast, guarded. "Evan Klein, this is Gabe Mercer," Gabe said. "Your aunt gave me your number. I found something tied to my father." Evan started to push back, so Gabe set the phone beside the tape player and hit play. His father's voice filled the kitchen and the line. "They're watching my house," Daniel said. Gabe stopped it. Evan didn't talk for a second. When he did, his voice was different, lower, focused. "Where are you?" "Out past town, Ranch Road." "Don't email, don't post," Evan said. "Lock up. I'm driving down. If anyone shows up, you don't open the door." Gabe looked at Rex. Rex stared back like he'd already made up his mind. "Bring a camera," Gabe said. "I'm bringing 2, Evan answered. Evan arrived after dark in a dusty sedan, eyes red from the road. He stepped in, saw Rex, and froze. Then he did the smart thing. He waited. Rex sniffed him, circled once, then sat. Evan let out a breath like he'd been holding it for a mile. Gabe set the logbook on the table. Evan photographed pages under the kitchen light, dates, initials, tight handwriting. He recorded the tape audio on his phone, holding it close to the speaker. The old machine hissed. The room smelled like coffee that had been reheated too many times. "This is proof," Evan said, voice thin. "This is a lot." Gabe didn't smile. "Proof brings people," he said. Rex's head snapped toward the yard. A low growl started. Evan heard it and went still. Then orange light flickered across the window glass. Gabe turned and saw it. Fire, climbing fast. "The barn," he said. "They lit my barn." Heat and smoke hit Gabe's face the moment he stepped outside. The smell was sharp. Burning hay, scorched wood, a bite of diesel. Wind shoved the flame sideways like it had hands. Gabe ran toward it with an extinguisher, then stopped when he saw movement by the house. A shadow cutting low. Too quick for a neighbor. Wood cracked. The back door. Rex launched past Gabe. No sound at first. Then a deep snarl as he hit the kitchen. Evan shouted. A chair crashed. A man's grunt, hard and angry. Gabe sprinted back and burst through the splintered frame. The kitchen was chaos. Evan on the floor scrambling, a masked man half-turned, one arm up. Rex slammed into him like a fullback and clamped down on his forearm. The sound was wet and awful. The man screamed high and raw. Gabe grabbed the attacker's gun hand and drove a short strike into his throat. The man choked, bucked, and yanked hard enough to tear free, leaving blood on the floor. Outside, a single sharp crack sounded. Then a fuel drum near the barn blew with a deep whoomp that rattled the windows. Heat flashed through the kitchen. For a half second, Gabe's body locked, reflex fighting him. Rex's growl cut through it, and Gabe moved again. The masked man staggered out the back. Gabe hit the porch in time to see a spotless black SUV, fishtail and gravel. Another man hauled the bleeding one inside. Taillights vanished down the ranch road. Rex stood at the threshold, muzzle smeared, chest heaving, holding the line. Gabe looked down and saw something glint in the firelight on the kitchen floor. A wallet torn and dropped. He opened it and read the name. Owen Pike. Behind the license was a laminated contractor card. Eagle Ridge Solutions, Defense Logistics. Smoke curled off the barn like a slow black flag, and every gust carried that sharp, oily burn that sticks to the back of your throat. Rex paced the kitchen threshold, nose low, then snapped his head toward the road and held still. Gabe took that as the first warning. The second warning sat in his hand, a torn wallet warm from the firelight, with a name inside, Owen Pike, and a laminated contractor card that read Eagle Ridge Solutions, Defense Logistics. Gabe didn't know their faces. He knew the category, men who worked behind paperwork and outside rules. Evan stood by the table with his phone in his hand, whispering, "We call 911. Gabe looked past him at the broken door and the blood on the floor where Rex had held the line. "Not county," Gabe said. "Not yet." Outside, tires crunched gravel. Headlights washed the yard. Sheriff Dalton Rusk rolled in like he'd been invited. His cruiser stopped short of the barn ruin, and he stepped out clean and unhurried, eyes taking inventory. Volunteer fire folks were already spraying the last hot spots, boots grinding ash into the dirt. Ray Cutter stood near the trough, face tight, watching the sheriff watch Gabe. Rusk didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Rough night," he said. "Barn fire, forced entry. That dog bite looks serious." Gabe kept his expression flat. "I didn't see who did it." Rusk's gaze slid to Rex, then to Evan. "And you are?" "Friend," Gabe said, cutting in. Rusk nodded once like he'd filed it away. "We'll make a report," he said. "In daylight. For now, keep everybody calm. Folks get hurt when they panic." He walked back to his cruiser, slow as a man who knew he'd be obeyed. Before he got in, he looked over his shoulder and said, "Mr. Mercer, don't go digging for more trouble." Then he left, and the yard felt colder than the morning air. Gabe shut the blinds. He pulled the kitchen lamp closer and set Evan's laptop on the table. Smoke still seeped in through the broken frame, mixing with the smell of old coffee. Rex sat square at the back door opening, chest forward, ears up, quiet but ready. Gabe flattened the leather logbook and fed page after page through a scanner. Evan saved the files and pushed them to an encrypted drive, then a second one. The progress bar crawled like a slow heartbeat. They recorded the tape straight from the reel-to-reel speaker into Evan's phone. Static hiss. Then Gabe's father's voice, steady, terrified, unmistakable. "They're watching my house," the voice said. Evan swallowed hard. "That's your dad." Gabe didn't answer. He kept his hand on Rex's shoulder until the tightness in his own chest eased. When the last file finished uploading, Evan whispered, "They can't erase this now." Gabe shook his head once. "They can still bury it." The yellow meter ticked on the counter. Tick, 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 soft as a second clock. Gabe pulled it from the feed sack and watched the needle sit above 0. Evan stared at it like it was a snake that hadn't struck yet. "Digital copies help the public," Gabe said. "Originals help the truth." He grabbed a gasketed ammo can from the workshop and packed it tight. Logbook, reels, wallet, card. The latch snapped shut with a heavy final clack. Rex trotted ahead as Gabe carried it into the north pasture. The stars were sharp. The stone hive stood darker than the rest of the land, like it drank the light. Gabe knelt beside the hatch frame and dug sideways with a short entrenching tool. Clay fought him like concrete. He kept going until he could slide the can deep under the rim where a casual search wouldn't reach. Rex sat guard, throat rumbling low, eyes sweeping the tree line. Gabe covered the spot, then drove the bulldozer blade forward until 10 tons of steel rested over it. He killed the engine and listened. Only wind, only Rex's breathing. "For now," Gabe said. Morning came pale and mean. The barn was a black skeleton. Ash dusted the porch like gray flour. Evan slept in a chair, jaw slack, laptop still open. Rex stayed awake, facing the road. Gabe checked his bank account. A red notice filled the screen. Account frozen. Federal Review. His phone buzzed. Unknown number. He put it on speaker. Rex stood. A low growl started like thunder under a blanket. A calm voice said, "Mr. Mercer, you've been busy." "Grant Hatcher." Gabe didn't speak. "We want what you took," Hatcher continued. "And we have something you want." A muffled woman's voice cut in, sharp with anger. "Gabe, don't you—" Gabe's stomach dropped. "Martha." Hatcher's tone stayed flat. "Dead horse wash. Noon. You bring the logbook, the tapes, and the wallet. You come alone. If we see your reporter friend, Martha doesn't go home." The line went dead. Evan came fully awake, his face white. "We call the sheriff." Gabe stared at the silent phone. "Rusk already knows," he said. "County shows up, she dies." Evan's hands shook. "Then what do we do?" Gabe grabbed a second ammo can and filled it with rusted tools and chain, heavy enough to sell a lie. "You do your job," Gabe said. "Camera on a ridge, one call to state police. Captain Ian Chambers, you wait for my signal." Rex pressed his head into Gabe's hand, steady and warm. Dead Horse Wash was red rock, gravel, and wide-open sky, quiet enough to hear your own breath. Heat shimmered off the stones. Creosote and dust rode the air. Gabe drove in alone, decoy can on the seat beside him. Rex was hidden behind the passenger seat under a dark blanket, silent as if he understood the rule. Evan wasn't in the truck. He'd already parked a mile out and climbed high with a camera and binoculars, sweat cutting clean tracks through dust on his cheeks. Before Gabe turned onto the wash road, Evan texted 3 words, in position, recording. Gabe didn't text back. Recording. Gabe didn't text back. He just tightened his grip on the wheel and listened to Rex's slow breathing behind him, steady and quiet. Gabe stopped near a cluster of boulders. A spotless black SUV waited, paint too clean for this place. 2 men stood beside it, one older, calm, one younger with an arm in a dirty sling. And between them, seated on a rock with her wrists tied, was Martha Klein. Gabe stepped out and shut his door soft. Martha lifted her chin and locked eyes with him. Rex didn't make a sound. Gabe stepped out of his truck and shut the door soft. The latch clicked like it was too loud out here. Heat shimmered off the red rock. Dust stuck to the sweat at the back of his neck. The wash smelled like creosote and hot stone. Martha Klein sat on a flat boulder between the two men, wrists tied, chin high. A strand of gray hair had come loose and was whipping across her cheek in the wind, but she didn't bow her head. The older one, Grant Hatcher, kept a hand on her shoulder. The younger one, Owen Pike, stood with his arm in a dirty sling and a pistol hanging loose at his side. Gabe held the ammo can by its handle, letting it swing once to show weight. Micro Hook 1 hit him fast. Fresh tire marks cut behind the SUV, angled toward a narrow slot in the wash. A second exit. Micro Hook 2 came from Martha. Her mouth barely moved. "Don't let him get close," she said, like she was talking to the wind. Behind Gabe's seat, under the blanket, Rex stayed silent. Gabe could feel the dog steady breathing through the cab wall. "Set it down," Hatcher called, voice smooth. "Then back up, hands open." Gabe walked forward 3 steps and stopped. Gravel popped under his boots. He set the can between them. The handle clanged once. "Let her walk," Gabe said. Pike lifted his pistol a few inches. "You're in no position." Hatcher didn't raise his voice. He just nodded at Pike, and Pike shifted to block Martha's knees, ready to drag her if Gabe rushed. Gabe watched Hatcher's hands. Clean. No desert grit. He also saw a small black earpiece tucked in Hatcher's ear. "Open it," Hatcher said. Gabe didn't move. "You open it, and she walks first." Hatcher's smile stayed in place. 3 seconds, Mr. Mercer." A faint radio chirp came from inside the SUV. Gabe caught another detail. Pike's eyes kept flicking to that narrow slot behind the boulders. Like he was waiting for a signal, Gabe lifted 2 fingers to his mouth and whistled. One sharp note. Glass burst from the back window of Gabe's truck. Rex came through hard and low, landing in a skid of claws and dust. Pike's eyes went wide. He half raised the pistol. Rex hit him first. Pike went down, the sling twisting, the gun skittering into gravel. Rex pinned him with his weight, teeth clamped on the sleeve, growling so deep it shook the air. Hatcher yanked Martha up, trying to use her as cover. Gabe closed the distance in 3 steps. He hooked Hatcher's wrist, drove it down, and turned his body. Hatcher's grip broke. Martha stumbled free and dropped to her knees, coughing. Hatcher swung at Gabe's throat. Gabe slipped it, caught the elbow, and shoved Hatcher into the rock face, hard enough to rattle his breath. Hatcher reached for his waistband. Gabe trapped the hand, twisted, and the pistol fell into the dirt. Hatcher tried to stomp it away. Gabe planted a boot over it and kept his balance, eyes never leaving Hatcher's shoulders. Up on the ridge, Evan's camera kept rolling, zooming tight through heat haze. He spoke into his phone, breath quick. "Captain Chambers, it's live. Dead Horse Wash, move." Below, Hatcher bucked and spat dust. "You don't understand what you've touched." Gabe kept his voice low. "You kidnapped an old woman." Hatcher's eyes flicked toward the tire marks and that narrow slot. He was counting a way out. Pike tried to crawl backward, palm searching for the gun. Rex shifted and blocked him, holding firm without tearing. Martha pushed herself up, dust on her cheeks, eyes locked on Hatcher. "You boys always think the desert is empty," she rasped. "It's not." Hatcher lunged. Gabe drove him down to one knee and held him there, steady as a vice. Hatcher's breath came fast now, and Gabe could smell mint on it, like the man had brushed his teeth before a kidnapping. The first siren came thin on the wind, then another. Red and blue flashes strobed across the wash walls. Hatcher froze. For the first time, his calm face cracked. State police vehicles poured in, dust pluming, blocking the slot, and sealing the main road behind Gabe's truck. Doors opened in a line, boots hit gravel, radios clipped and chirped, short and sharp. Captain Ian Chambers stepped out, weapon low but ready. "Hands where I can see 'em, now!" Gabe backed off and lifted his palms. Victims here, 2 armed men. Chambers' eyes cut to Rex, pinning Pike. "Call your dog off," Gabe said. "Rex, off." Rex released it once and stepped back, chest heaving, still guarding. Troopers cuffed Pike, then Hatcher. A burner phone and zip ties spilled from Hatcher's pocket and hit the dirt. Martha stood on her own feet, shaking once, then steady. She grabbed Gabe's forearm, quick and firm. "Thank you," she said. That night, Martha's kitchen smelled like black tea and lemon cleaner. An EMT wrapped her wrists and cleared her, while Rex lay by the doorway, eyes half-lidded but listening. Evan sat at the table with his laptop open, uploading the footage and the audio he'd captured, watching the progress bar crawl like it didn't want to finish. Outside, Ray Cutter and Fire Chief Ortega showed up with water, boards, and quiet hands ready to help. No one asked Gabe to tell the story. They could see it on his face. At the VFW hall, somebody set a jar on the counter with a hand-lettered sign, "Barn Rebuild, Mercer Ranch." Bills went in, change went in. A waitress from the diner dropped in a 20 and didn't meet anyone's eyes. The coffee pot kept hissing. The radio hummed low with late-night country. Gabe watched strangers nod at him like he belonged. Rex got a water bowl without anyone making a face. Evan leaned close. "The kidnapping is on video," he said. "The arson, the contractor ID. They can't erase this part." Gabe stared at the tabletop, thinking of that soft tick he'd heard all day, like time still kept score. 2 days later, the courthouse air smelled like copier toner and old carpet. Gabe sat on a hard bench with Rex's leash wrapped once around his hand. Martha sat behind him, back straight. Evan held a notepad, jaw tight. Hatcher and Pike were brought in wearing cuffs. The prosecutor spoke in careful terms. Kidnapping, arson, impersonation, nothing else. When Evan stood and tried to mention Project Duskline, the judge cut him off. "Not in this room," he said. "Excluded pending federal review." Gabe felt the floor drop inside his ribs. In the back row, Sheriff Dalton Rusk sat with his arms folded and a small smile on his mouth, like he'd just won something without lifting a finger. Rusk met Gabe's eyes for 1 second, then looked away, calm as ever. Gabe walked out of the courthouse into sunlight that felt too hard on his eyes. The air smelled like hot pavement and windblown dust. Rex stayed close at his knee, leash loose, ears working. Sheriff Dalton Rusk leaned against a pillar behind them, calm as a man watching a game he already rigged. Microhook 1 hit at Gabe's truck door. A stranger in a suit brushed past and murmured, "You keep pushing, people get hurt." He didn't stop walking. Microhook 2 came from Rex. The dog's head snapped toward the street, and a low warning rolled out of him. A black SUV slid by, slow, windows dark, tires whispering. It didn't turn in, it just passed, like a finger pointed at Gabe's life. Evan Klein kept pace, face tight. "They gagged anything about the project," he said. "They're trying to make it only kidnapping and arson." Gabe opened the door and glanced back once. Rusk's small smile didn't move. "Kidnapping and arson are plenty," Gabe said. "We make those stick." Voici wekampaumt bauen Stal. By evening, the VFW hall filled with the smell of burnt coffee and old pine cleaner. Chairs scraped. A radio hummed low behind the bar. Martha Klein stood with bruises on her wrists and a yellow legal pad in her hand. "We're not doing rumors," she said. "We're doing statements." Fire Chief Lila Ortega spoke first. "I saw a spotless SUV near Mercer Road, same night as the barn fire. No dust on it. Wrong for out here." The diner waitress swallowed hard. Deputy Harlan grabbed the leash first. Sheriff walked in right after, like the room was waiting for him. Ray Cutter added, "That black SUV's been near Gabe's gate more than once. It never stops long. It just wants you to notice." Rex lay under Gabe's chair, warm against his boot, eyes open. Gabe kept one hand on Rex's shoulder until his own breathing stayed steady. Evan looked up from his laptop. "Eagle Ridge Solutions has county money on the books," he said. "Security consulting, fuel reimbursements, signed through the sheriff's office." Microhook. The room went quiet. Then the quiet changed. Folks started nodding, like a plan was forming without anyone naming it. The next morning, a plain sedan rolled in. Captain Ian Chambers got out with a man in a rumpled shirt and a recorder. The man introduced himself as Mark Dugan, a state investigator. No swagger, just tired eyes and careful words. In Gabe's kitchen, the boards over the broken door still smelled like fresh-cut pine. The coffee pot hissed once, then went quiet. Dugan sat at the table and glanced at Rex posted by the opening, like a silent fence. "I'm here about the kidnapping, arson, and intimidation," Dugan said. "Not county, state." Gabe's phone buzzed on the counter. Unknown number. One vibration, then another. Dugan watched Gabe watch it. Micro hook. Rex's growl started low, steady, like he recognized the pattern. Gabe didn't pick up. He slid the phone face down. Evan laid out the contractor card and wallet photos. Dugan nodded once. "We know Eagle Ridge," he said. "They clean up messes. Sometimes they make them." Chambers spoke like it hurt him. "Rusk's been blocking my deputies," he said. "He's got people scared." Dugan leaned forward. "Then we work around him," he said. "Show me where this site is." Out in the north pasture, wind pushed grit across the bulldozer tracks. The stone hive sat on dead ground, ugly and stubborn. Gabe stopped at the dozer blade parked heavy over the buried hatch. Rex stood close, nose high, scanning the empty distance. Dugan walked the perimeter and crouched without touching. "Old Federal build," he said, "buried on purpose." Then engines came in from the ranch road, smooth, controlled, not local pickups. Micro hook. Rex stiffened so fast his nails clicked on steel. 2 white trucks rolled in, each with a magnetic placard that read, "Site Management." A spotless black vehicle followed like a shadow. A man in a clean hard hat stepped down and held out papers. "Federal order," he said. "We're securing the site." Dugan read the top page and exhaled through his nose. Chambers muttered, "They're claiming jurisdiction." Gabe watched the black vehicle's window lower a fraction. He didn't see a full face, but he saw comfort. Whoever sat inside wasn't worried. Rex's growl stayed low. Gabe's hands stayed still. "They came fast," Gabe said. Dugan's jaw tightened. "Too fast." Dugan wanted sunlight and witnesses, so he called a short briefing on the courthouse steps that afternoon. Evan set up his camera. Martha brought the waitress and the firefighter. Folks from the VFW showed up and stood quiet, arms folded, listening. Sheriff Rusk arrived, of course. He stood off to the side with Deputy Harlan, calm mouth, relaxed shoulders. Dugan walked straight to Gabe. "Gabe Mercer," he said, then paused, eyes narrowing like a memory clicking into place. "Former Navy." Gabe didn't boast. He just nodded. Dugan stuck out his hand and said it clearly, for the record, for the camera. "Chief Mercer." Rusk froze. It was small, but it was real. His smile stopped moving. His eyes flicked to Dugan's badge, then to Evan's camera, then back to Gabe like he was recalculating. "Bro hook." Evan's phone chimed right then with an email from his editor. Legal warning, heavy language. Evan read it, face tightening. "They'll publish the kidnapping," he whispered. "They won't touch the project." He looked at Gabe. "They're trying to starve the truth." Dugan turned to the crowd. "If you have information, you contact my office directly," he said. "Not the county." Rusk walked away without a word. 2 days later, concrete trucks arrived with the kind of low rumble you feel in your ribs. The air filled with diesel and wet cement, sharp and chalky. Wind carried it across the pasture and stuck it in the back of Gabe's throat. Gabe stood at the fence line with Rex pressed against his leg. Warm fur, steady weight. Martha stood beside them, hands clenched. Evan filmed without blinking. Workers laid forms and rebar like they were building a sidewalk. Then the chute swung and gray slurry poured out, thick as a slow river. It swallowed the hatch and the disturbed earth around it. A supervisor pressed a stamp into the wet surface. U.S. Government. Do not tamper. The slab shone for a minute under the sun, then dulled as it started to cure. The finishing tools made a soft scrape that sounded too ordinary for what it was doing. Ooh, micro hook. Gabe's mind supplied a sound that wasn't there anymore. A faint tick he remembered from the meter, like time-keeping score. Evan lowered the camera. "They sealed it," he said. Gabe stared at the clean edge of the slab, then at the plain dirt just beside it. Ordinary, untouched, easy to ignore. "No," he said. "They sealed what they wanted people to see." Rex leaned into him, calm and heavy. And the desert wind swept grit across fresh concrete, already trying to make the whole thing look like it had always been there. Gabe stood at the fence line and watched the concrete cure. Wet cement smell hung in the air, sharp and chalky. Diesel fumes drifted as the trucks rolled out. Rex pressed against Gabe's leg, warm and steady, ears working the wind. Evan lowered his camera. "They're burying it again," he said. Gabe's phone buzzed. Unknown number. Rex's throat gave a low rumble, and his ears pinned forward at the road. Gabe answered. Mercer? Mark Dugan's voice came through calm and clipped. I've got enough to hit the sheriff's office. Warrant goes in tonight. Gabe felt that old pressure in his chest. Rusk will hear it. Let him, Dugan said. Chain your gate. If anybody shows up, you call me, not county. Gabe hung up. A black SUV slid past on the ranch road, windows dark, tires whispering. It didn't turn in. Rex watched it disappear and stayed standing. That night, the sheriff's office stayed lit past midnight. State cars parked out back, boxes carried in, doors shut. Quiet work. By 2 a.m, Dugan and Captain Chambers were on Gabe's porch. The screen door rattled in the wind. Dust scratched along the boards. Rex stood beside Gabe, shoulder against shin, reading both men before he eased. Dugan kept it plain. Rusk signed county checks to Eagle Ridge. He routed them through training and emergency response. We pulled calls. Rusk to Hatcher's burner the night your barn went up. We've got invoices, call logs, and a clerk ready to testify. Gabe stared into the dark yard. So it's him? It's him, Chambers said. Dugan nodded once. We're taking him in early, then we go after the contract. Gabe put his hand on Rex's head. Do it. Tuesday morning, the diner smelled like bacon grease and dish soap. The radio behind the counter buzzed weather through static. Gabe sat with coffee that was finally hot. Rex lay under the table with his head on Gabe's boot, eyes open. Martha sat across from Gabe, sleeves down over her wrists. Evan sat beside him, phone in his palm, recording. Outside, 2 state police cruisers stopped at the sheriff's office. Doors shut. Boots hit pavement. Rex lifted his head and went still. Sheriff Dalton Rusk walked out like he meant to talk his way through it. Clean uniform, calm face. That small smile. Dugan read the arrest aloud, clear and slow. A trooper cuffed Rusk anyway. Metal clicked. The sound carried through the diner glass. Rusk's eyes found Gabe for 1 second. Calculation, not rage. Then the cruiser door shut. In the doorway behind him, Deputy Harlan stood pale and rigid, staring at the sidewalk like it might swallow him. Gabe didn't cheer. He just exhaled and felt his shoulders drop a fraction. The weeks after weren't magic. They were work. The barn was still a black skeleton at first, but fresh lumber stacked beside it. Sawdust smelled sweet in the sun. Hammers tapped. A circular saw whined, then quit, leaving wind and silence. Ray Cutter hauled boards like it was nothing. Fire Chief Ortega brought volunteers. VFW guys carried tin roofing. Somebody set a coffee urn on a folding table, and the smell of burnt coffee mixed with fresh-cut pine. People worked, took a sip, worked again. No speeches. Just hands. Evan kept filing stories that stayed inside what the court allowed. Kidnapping, arson, a sheriff's office handing public money to a private security outfit. It was enough to keep eyes on the case. Dugan sent word through Chambers. Hatcher and Pike took plea deals. Eagle Ridge's county contract was suspended. The clean shoe visits stopped. Rex moved through it all like he had a job. He checked the edges. He sat when a kid asked, then went right back to Gabe. A plain envelope arrived with a bank letter. The account freeze lifted, the foreclosure paused pending review. Gabe read it twice and set it down. Not trust, just air. That night, he sat on the porch with coffee and listened to the new barn frame creak as it cooled. Rex leaned against his boot, warm fur and steady breath. Town changed in small ways. The old "no dog" sign vanished from the diner window. One morning, the owner set a stainless water bowl near the cool end of the counter. For him, she said, nodding at Rex. He belongs. Rex drank, then came back and sat close to Gabe's leg. Gabe ate slow. The bell over the door chimed, and it was just a bell. At the VFW, Martha started a monthly breakfast, vet and K9, pancakes, coffee, a table of phone numbers, space for a man to talk, and space for him not to. She asked Gabe to help with the walking group after breakfast, not therapy talk. Just a loop around the lot, boots on gravel, lungs working, shoulders loosening. An older Marine sat down beside Gabe, hands shaking around a paper cup. Night gets loud, he said. Gabe nodded. Yeah, want to take a walk after breakfast? The man swallowed, then nodded back. That was enough. On the first cool morning of fall, Gabe walked Rex out to the north pasture. The concrete slab was still there, pale against the dirt, stamped like a warning. Wind pushed dry grass against its edge. The stone hive threw a long shadow. Gabe looked at the ordinary patch of dirt beside the slab. No marker, just earth. The ammo can was still there, buried deep where only he and Rex knew. He could dig it up. He could carry it around like a weapon. He could spend his life waiting for the next clean-shoed stranger. Instead, he put his palm on Rex's head and felt the thick fur under his fingers. Warm. Real. "We did what we had to," Gabe said, voice low. "Now, we do what we can." Rex looked up and gave one slow wag. Gabe turned toward home. The rebuilt barn frame stood on the horizon, fresh wood catching the sun. From the kitchen, he could almost smell coffee and hear the soft hum of the radio. He walked back with Rex at his side, and the ranch didn't feel like a battlefield anymore. It felt like a place that wanted him back, and the quiet felt earned at last.